Greetings to the viewers of this Faith and Fire 2.0 conversation on faith in the public square. I am Minister Christian S. Watkins, the Justice Advocacy and Outreach Manager for the National Council of Churches. Thank you for joining us. Today, we will be discussing faithful democracy, U.S. voting rights, and D.C. statehood. I'm thrilled to have this conversation and to be in conversation with such esteemed colleagues. Without further ado, definitely want to introduce to you all Sister Quincy Howard. She is the coordinating director for Faithful Democracy, a collection, a collaborative of justice advocacy co-conspirators to move power and organize people in the way of justice in regards to voting rights and the sacred act of voting in the United States. Quincy, thank you for joining us. Breon Wells, we have Breon Wells. He's the president and founder of the Daniel Initiative. They are doing marvelous, excellent, very inspiring work in the ways of justice for not just the least, last, and lost, not just for African Americans, but for the disabled community, for various other communities that definitely do need justice in America. So, Breon, thank you very much for joining us. And then last but not least, we have Beau Shuff. He is the executive director of DC Vote, the DC Statehood, a premier DC Statehood initiative. So Beau, thank you very much for joining us. I will allow you all to introduce yourselves further, give us a little bit of who you are, what you're about, what brings you to this space of justice advocacy, and the reason and your initial comments on our conversation today, faithful democracy. What it means to you. Sister Quincy, if you would, come first.
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you. It's so nice to be here with my colleagues. Always a pleasure. So I am a Dominican sister of Sinsinawa, a Catholic sister, and I really came to DC about 4 years ago to work at Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice, which was started by Catholic sisters in the early 70s. Network has a multi-issue platform that they advocate around federal policy changes, many of them having to do with poverty reduction, food insecurity, immigration rights. So I had a large portfolio, including labor and voting rights, as I worked with Network. And the more I dug into the work, the more I started realizing that democracy really is where all of these issues come together. And it is the foundational issue for all of the things that we want to see happen and the world that we want to create in the United States. And I also started to realize that many of our partner organizations and Network itself didn't really have the bandwidth or the capacity to give due focus to the issue of the health of our democracy and the well-being of our democratic institutions. So I started moving more and more into that realm of advocacy and ultimately ended up as the coordinating director of the Faithful Democracy Coalition, which you mentioned is an interfaith coalition of congregations and faith-based advocacy organizations that most of us, like Network, don't have the capacity to give due credence to work on democracy. So I have really devoted myself to enabling our partners, including Network Lobby, to keep that issue front and center, even as we work on all of the other issues of justice that we work on. And that was, I'm going to say, a year and a half ago or 2 years ago that I really sort of dug in deep into the democracy work. It felt urgent then. I had no idea the path that was in front of us with COVID and with the 2020 election. And then with post-2020 election shenanigans that are happening right now. So I sort of laugh at my naivete of the sense of urgency that I felt back in 2019 about issues of democracy and voting rights. And I would also add that along with voting rights, we also look at money in politics and the deeply concerning trends that we're seeing there. as well as government ethics, because that is also another area of our foundational institutions that we're seeing really harmful actions take place that need to be repaired quickly. So that's how I ended up working in the capacity that I'm working in right now. And it's been very fulfilling to help my colleagues and partners like you, Christian, at NCC, one of our wonderful partners on our steering committee, find the most effective ways to engage in a conversation around democracy and push the changes that we know we need to see at this time.
Thank you very much for that brilliant overview, and you've given us fuel for fodder for the rest of the conversation. Next, Breon Wells, come and introduce yourself. Let us know who you are and what you're about.
Sure. Glad to be here in this conversation. My name is Breon Wells, the president and founder of the Daniel Initiative. Prior to founding the Daniel Initiative 9 years ago, actually, I was a Hill staffer, a policy advisor, a congressional aide, dealing in a host of issues, but mostly national security. And so when I came off of the Hill, one of the reasons I started the Daniel Initiative was because we lacked adequate numbers of Black folks, brown folks, indigenous folks, formerly incarcerated individuals, peoples with disabilities who were sitting at the highest points of these policy tables and actually writing legislation. I was blessed to be in a committee and work on a committee that often on Capitol Hill, the committees are the spaces where policy is originated and drives the ship. And so we endeavored to make space where we either represent for our clients their interests, or helping to multiply the number of individuals, activists, organizers who are more knowledgeable of these spaces of power and able to navigate it, because we strongly believe that you cannot adequately dismantle a system that you don't know and that you don't study. And so it was that brought me to the work. And the reason we do government relations, strategic communications, and social impact strategies is because all three are necessary. We find that our average clients that we, when I formed this 9 years ago, that I got in here to help were the people who are actually doing the work on the ground. The ones who are making waves with often little to no resources, the ones who don't get the microphone, but yet are persevering, pressing through, and really changing society, changing cultures, and shifting these spaces. And so what we help add to them is strategy. The last thing I'll say about the Daniel Initiative before I talk about the topic at hand, I built the Daniel Initiative off of the factual narrative of Daniel in the Bible. When you pare it down, he was a consultant, he was an advisor to many of these kings and these rulers of that day. And the strategies were long thought out and far reaching and intentional. And the reason that matters is because I think that one of the things that is lacked today in both the religious spaces, and I can say that as a faith leader for many years, but even in the social justice spaces, we pull up at these spaces as if we could just roll out of bed and come here without the excellence and the strategy, as if Care Bear stairs, as I say often to my clients, don't win wars. It's not enough to just say, this is wrong and this is outrageous. What is your strategy to counteract what has really always existed? These systems of oppression that have always existed. And so we find that, there's a necessity for excellence and strategies with the bleeding hearts that need to be a part of it. It's great to have passion, but we need to pull up at these tables with more of a strategy to get the wins that we need and that the people that we represent need and deserve. When we talk about, voting rights, a lot of our stuff at the Daniel Initiative is crafted with the thought of collective liberation. And that principle says that none of us are free until all of us are free. And from a policy space, our standard at the Daniel Initiative is that any solutions that we derive in the policy space for one marginalized or multi-marginalized community cannot and should not do harm to another multi-marginalized or social justice community. it begs us to find the correlation between environmental justice and criminal justice transformation and voting rights and national security and health equity and tech equity. All of those things are connected. And you're often, if we want to be honest, are talking about the same populations of people. And so when we're talking about collective liberation, we don't shy away from talking about the real issue, which is racial equity. And when we're talking about voting rights and we're talking about democracy, white wealthy landowning men were the first ones that were franchised in this country. And that means that every system that exists was not built by them, but was built for their furtherance. And even when, not to be divisive, but to be honest, even when white women under the 19th Amendment were given the right to vote, it was under the furtherance of white wealthy landowning men. And then even when immigrants that were white got that eventually. So, this means that the systems that we see today and the reform is a problematic word for us at the Daniel Initiative, because what we need is transformation. And that lines up theologically, right? If we were going to scripture, the Bible tells us, don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And so it says, really, we've got to do away with what has currently existed and bring to the table in a more diverse and equitable way, solutions that help everyone access that power. And that is through the voting box, that is through the ballot box. And so that's why I'm looking forward to this conversation about voting rights, about DC statehood, which has been here long before, the Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett things, where DC started to realize, wait a minute, we don't have representation in the Senate to even sign off or obstruct some of these things. And so looking forward to this discussion.
Breon, you have given us a lot to consider. I love the way your brain works, especially when it comes to developing your organization. You should be teaching master classes somewhere on doing that, what you just brilliantly laid out, because that transformation, that biblical foundation, and also the biblical foundations of who Daniel was and what Daniel was called to do, and how you do it through other organizations. That is some awesome work. If you can, give me those 3 areas of focus one more time before we go to Beau.
Absolutely. So we do government relations, which includes lobbying. So that's advocacy, just general advocacy and education awareness, but then lobbying. Mm-hmm. We do strategic communication. So of course, people communicating that message. We have clients who speak on the news that are faces that people are familiar with. And then as well, social impact. So making sure that whether you're an influencer or an activist and advocate, we believe that everyone has social and political capital, and we help you best steward that.
Wow, that is awesome. That's awesome. I pray much success in your future. Beau, if you would, come on and let us know who you are and what you're about.
Absolutely. And again, thanks for having me and inviting us to this panel. My name is Beau Shuff. I'm the executive director of DC Vote. We are the longest serving equality for DC organization, for lack of a better way to say it, voting rights for DC. And in the last 6 years have really focused on the fight of DC statehood. Over time, we've been around for 22, 23 years, and over that time, we've been involved in fights to gain residents of DC budget autonomy. That's the ability to control our own spending, our own local taxes, legislative autonomy, which is the ability to pass our own laws and not have them overturned by Congress. We've worked to make sure that our representative has a voice in the Congress, even though she doesn't have a vote. And we've worked to defend the district against incursions from representatives from other places, people we didn't vote for, deciding to overturn or defund some of our laws. Like I said, for the last 5 years, our focus has really been on DC statehood, because when you add up all of those pieces that I was just talking about, statehood is the umbrella that not the umbrella, that is the repair for all of them. And it's the only permanent repair that isn't up to congressional whims. I come to this effort in a sort of circuitous and very secular way. I come out of advocacy and campaign, political campaigns, candidate campaigns, I should say, sort of alternating between the two, spending time deep diving into an issue, and then removing myself from that in order to advocate for individuals who I think are going to move that issue or those values forward. Most recently, I had the honor to serve as Mayor Muriel Bowser's campaign manager in 2014. And at that time, that's really what brought me to statehood. So I always knew it was an issue, sort of, in the back of your head, right? Like, that brushing your teeth or not brushing your teeth is an issue. But you don't sort of always know exactly why and how deep the impact is going to be. And being part of the mayor's campaign team really exposed me to the district in a new way. It helped me introduce myself and meet and experience and learn from different neighborhoods and different populations that I had never been part of, and see how our lack of representation, while on the surface is troubling, uh, also really seeps into every issue facing the residents of the District of Columbia. It comes to play whether we're talking about affordable housing or quality healthcare or quality education or funding for our services or what have you. And so that's really when I got to join this effort. A couple of years after that campaign, the board of directors approached me. I think they were approaching me to join the board, and the conversation went a different direction. And 6 years later, here I am. Um, our work is really fundamentally about educating the American people. Over the last 5 years, we have seen a change in support for statehood in close to 20 points in public polling, from 37 to 54. And that's directly due to a lot of the work that we've done, as well as some, outside atmospheric stuff that has changed as people are looking at voting rights and looking at what are the systems of democracy that aren't working and how do we repair them. And so we've been engaged coast to coast, trying to educate folks around what statehood means, and also obviously trying to educate here in the district among advocacy organizations and issue-based organizations to make the connections between issues that people care about and how they're impacted by DC's lack of statehood. And that comes to bear in every single issue area that you can think of, whether that's LGBTQ rights, whether it's the environment, whether it's our occupational safety and health administration laws. All of them are impacted for the residents of the district by our lack of statehood. So it is a fight to me that is all encompassing and all important, and the insidiousness of the roots of it in both really just racial discrimination and racism, as well as economic and classism, is just really challenging and a fascinating thing for me to work on and hopefully teach some people about.
Beau, I appreciate your work and your fervor in doing it. And it's awesome that you're using your gifts and previous experiences with legislative engagement, with participating with political campaigns, in order that better informs your work. And since we're on the topic, given the disparaging state of affairs, I want to talk about the granular level DC statehood issues and what we're dealing with, especially with the Washington DC being what is it, 48% African American. I believe that's the latest stat, 46, 48, somewhere around there, 46.
I think it's 46.7 to be specific.
Gotcha. Especially with that, what I'm seeing, what I'm envisioning, what's running around in my head is that what DC is going through, what DC is fighting for, is the basis of why voting rights throughout the United States are so important, and this fight is so important. So I want to pick your brain a little bit, and then we'll Breon interject with racial equity. Your racial equity expertise as it pertains to DC statehood, and then we'll expand it into the greater faithful democracy, voting rights issues. Does that sound good for y'all? All right. So Beau, give us a download. With the disparaging state of affairs throughout the United States?
Yeah, I mean, there's DC statehood. We've made a really concerted effort to help people understand the connections between DC statehood and the overall voting rights conversations that are happening. One of the things we learned very quickly in 2016 after that election, as we headed into the inauguration and then the Women's March the very next day, was that people were taking a brand new look at how systems of democracy and representation are working. People don't necessarily believe our democracy is broken. They believe that it needs repair, and they believe that it needs some TLC to get it back to, for many people, back to where it should be. And for another large swath of people, it needs to get where it should be for the first time. And that's where DC statehood comes into effect. We have long called it one of the original forms of voter suppression, and we have absolutely called it the very first gerrymander. They literally drew a line around us and told us we could not have representation. And because of the racial makeup of the district, which is not an accident, is not circumstantial and is not coincidental. The racial makeup of the District of Columbia is directly related to federal policy that encouraged African American individuals to come here to the district once they were free and demanded they come here when they were slaves. And so you cannot ever separate the connection between our racist history and the present state of affairs for a majority African American district. We have a majority Black district that is overseen and ruled by a majority white body. And in that body, we have no say. It is literally a textbook definition of racism, and it needs to be addressed as such. And to ignore that is really challenging if you're going to have an honest conversation about what it means. And it also impacts how your problem solving happens, right? It cannot be just about giving us 2 senators and still keeping us as this weird district. It cannot be about taking the land that is here and sticking it back to Maryland, even though we were only part of Maryland for 2 years, because there's racial overtones and racist actions undermining that action as well. But that is exactly the fight that we are seeing with gerrymandering in Georgia, or the inability to gain voter IDs in North Dakota if you live on a Native American reservation, or the change in voter laws as far as drop boxes in Texas. Right, we know that all of these things are aimed at communities of color, almost specifically at Black Americans in many places, others as well in other places. And all of those roots, all of that voter suppression, all of it is built based on the idea of maintaining power of the race that is in power and making sure that those votes can't be counted.
Breon, come in with us and let's tease out more of the racial equity aspect of what's going on and what's being denied.
Yeah, so and definitely Beau hit the nail on the head, and he's surrounded, I know, even in the work that he does by such greats as Dara Baldwin and others who could give a better litany of this than I could. But I'll say that as I was looking at, and the reason I brought up Christine Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh is because, my parents are products, born and raised in Southeast Washington, D.C. And so D.C. is home here. And this cry of no taxation without representation has been something that has been a continuous cry since D.C. was Chocolate City, right? And it was amazing and sad at the same point when we got to Brett Kavanaugh's hearing and Christine Blasey Ford. And you had, again, well-meaning people, but coming to this conversation like, well, DC, what do you mean we don't have a say? DC's not a state, and yet you've had Black people screaming about this for a while. And I'm a real believer in transformation, so much so that, we can't be transformed, or we can't even fix a problem, even if it's not transformation, until there's honesty. And if we're honest, we have had countless Black voices, Indigenous voices, brown voices saying no taxation without representation. We're seeing somewhat of a shift, which is welcome, but we still need to acknowledge, due to gentrification, we have, white people with money that are now like, wait a minute, I'm not going to settle for having zero voice and zero say in this. And the reason I bring that up along racial equity, terms is we have this pernicious history and this divide that really needs to heal, where we use the terminology of we when we want Black and brown people to come in and help what has just been highlighted to the white community as something. And the feeling in the Black community and the history is sometimes it's been the last one's in, but the first one's out. And so, part of this healing and part of this moving forward says, yes, we need DC statehood. And we absolutely need to make that an imperative and top of the agenda. But it's also acknowledging who has been on the ground traditionally calling for this And are we making sure that we're empowering, amplifying, setting up those spaces? Because racial equity would call for that the directly impacted, then when DC does become a state, and we ought to claim that, we're going to work hard to make it happen. When DC does become a state, who are our senators? What do they look like? Who are our congressional delegations? What does it look like? Is it in a space where all people actually have access to that power? Or, are we about to do this thing again where there was a few who just got here and was inconvenienced, and now we've gotten that, but we have not fixed, transformed the bigger problem. And so that's why, that uncomfortable, albeit, but righteous conversation of racial equity is always something that needs to be on top of mind, not just with DC statehood, not just with voting rights, but really literally in every other context. Because when we say systemic and institutionalized racism, we're saying that it is the fabric, the bedrock of a lot of the things, the assumptions, the communications that built what we see and experience today.
I'm grateful for your examination of the racial equity issue of DC statehood, but also your articulation of, honoring those who did the work before, honoring those who have been crying, who have been agitating the system, aggravating leaders, organizing and demonstrating and mobilizing people. It's reflective of what I see as a lens that I see my theology, womanism. I have a womanist lens that I view all scripture through in order to make sure I'm not leaving out those who have been leaders but underrepresented. So that's the reason I appreciate our colleague, Dara Baldwin. That's the reason I greatly appreciate Andrea Alexander and Leslie Copeland of my organization, and many countless others that have been doing the work and often uncelebrated. But at the same time, when Black women lead, AKA Stacey Abrams, magnanimous things happen. Right. So I appreciate that part of the conversation. And, and also through that, there have been many provocations. Sister Quincy, if you would come, give us what you see as, the state of affairs right now, also pertaining to the national federal level issues that Stacey Abrams has done a brilliant job of elevating for us.
Yeah, thank you. So appreciate that conversation on DC. I am one of those latecomer white people that moved to DC and became aware of the issue. I think I had heard about it, but it's so true what Breon says about the changing population, and that is what in some ways, unfortunately, has allowed the issue to become a nationally recognized issue. So I think it's important to give some context on the federal level when it comes to voting rights, that Breon's intro actually about the contextual systems and exclusion that are so ingrained in our nation's history are important to keep in mind when you think about voting rights, because many Americans think about the US as the original democracy. We are the one that taught the world how to do it, right? It is so important to recognize that the default in the United States is voter suppression, right? From the origin of the United States, as Breon mentioned, it was white landholding men. We have chipped away over the last 250 years at that system, and thank God have made progress, a lot of progress, but that is still the default. And what we are seeing right now is a very rapid downward spiral back into that default. So to give some additional context, when we saw the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that really created a bastion against that backsliding. So it was, as I'm sure people are familiar, a pivotal bill that did fundamental things to protect the right to vote, which is guaranteed in the Constitution. And what we saw in 2013 with the Shelby ruling of the Supreme Court was some serious damage done to that bastion to protect voting rights, particularly for communities of color. And we saw Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which was rendered essentially useless and unenforceable. And what that section did was to ensure that the states that are known for their techniques and their voter suppression laws and rules would have to pre-clear any proposed rules or voting changes with the Department of Justice before they could move forward. And the reason for that was to make sure that they were not going to have those kinds of impacts on communities of color that would suppress the vote. And that worked very well for decades and was the bastion I mentioned until it was cut down. And immediately after that Supreme Court ruling, we saw states like my home state of Texas begin to propose exactly those laws and those rules that would have been prevented from happening by the Department of Justice before that. And since for the last 8 years, we have seen sort of a steady trickle in states across the nation, pushing those laws forward sort of on the DL, maybe not making a big fanfare about it, although there were always people in those states that were raising their hands and saying, hey, they're not supposed to do this. We already decided they're not supposed to do this. How do we get the protection we need? What was left to them is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which would then enable you to challenge rules that have been passed by states on the fact that they do have discriminatory impacts to suppress the vote in communities of color, in communities with the disabled community. So that was the only tool available after the 2013 ruling. And the sad thing about the Section 5 is that, I mean, Section 2 is that the elections are usually already done by the time you get justice. So the damage is done, even if the rule is eventually undone. Those people have lost their voices in whatever elections have passed, and the parties have been elected and will hold office. And I think when we think about the 2020 election and how that plays into this narrative, it is really, really important to understand that the 2020 election, as pivotal as it was in the divided environment that it was, politically divided, in the middle of a global pandemic, fear-based, fear, the unknown, confusion, because every vote has their own voting rules and they were changing to accommodate the dangers of COVID. And that environment was exploited by powerful voices, including the president, the former President Trump, to undermine people's trust in our democratic systems and our ability to carry out an election. And we also, at the same time, saw an extremely successful election in that we had the highest voter turnout in over a century. So we should have been applauding our people for getting out the vote, for braving a global pandemic to make sure that their voices were heard. And instead, what we saw was additional undermining of trust in the outcome of the election. And the fact that so many Black and brown people showed up to vote must mean that something was wrong with the election. And that narrative, which is now known as the big lie, has then been used by states across the nation to push the same kind of voting laws that would formerly, under the Voting Rights Act, have been, they wouldn't have been able to pass them because they are suppressive and they do have impacts on communities of color that are disproportionate from other communities. So we've seen sort of what we saw between 2013 and 2020 really on steroids in 2021 in a way that cannot be exaggerated. And sadly, to sort of put a cherry on that horrific cake, we have seen the latest Supreme Court ruling, which was just a month or so ago, that essentially cut down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which was what was left to communities to challenge these kinds of rules. And what the Supreme Court said was that, well, okay, maybe a rule or a new voting law does have discriminatory impacts on communities of color. But, you know, if there's a reasonable rationale for putting that rule forward, like in Arizona, where they were worried about voter fraud, and that was the rationale they used to justify it, then that's okay. That's not something that can be struck down because of the impacts it has. It's about the intention, and it's very hard to prove intention. So we have sort of the perfect storm of all of these systems being undermined. We can't depend on the legal system. We can't depend on states to do the right thing, excuse me. And so Breon also talked about strategy being so important. I would just say that get out the vote is not a strategy. We've been hearing a lot from the president about sort of needing to mobilize more, needing to get out the vote in 2022, and we can do this. That is not the strategy that we need. We need federal legislation. We need federal legislation to restore the Voting Rights Act so that it can remain the bastion that it has been moving forward to prevent discriminatory rules. And we also need the For the People Act, which is a critical laying baseline of expectations for access to the ballot for everyone in the United States, regardless of your zip code, regardless of your state, regardless of your race, regardless of your disability. You have reasonable expectations on access to the ballot that you can demand. And that's what the For the People Act would do. I just want to add one more thing about it, is that the For the People Act would actually be Congress utilizing powers in a new way. But these are powers that Congress is explicitly granted in the Constitution under the Elections Clause, that they can name for federal elections the time and the manner of those elections to take place. They will now lean into that and use that power that has remained latent, because it's time to do that. And if we need to change or get rid of a Senate rule that is outdated and extremely unhelpful and has a racist history, then that's what it's going to take, and we need to move forward and do that.
If I may, Christian,
Sure.
because, and absolutely, Sister Quincy, that was, wonderful, and I think that it's spot on, because federal legislation has always been needed and necessary. And I want to underscore what she just said. It's not that Congress has never had this power. One of the things people have to understand is Congress can do whatever it wants to do, as long as it gets unanimous consent. So we're not talking about possibilities or impossibilities. We're talking about appetite. We're talking about what they have an appetite for. And traditionally, Congress has not had an appetite to step into what they feel are state rights. Wow. But I would gently remind everyone that we had a whole civil war that was over states' rights to own Black people. And so if you're from a multi-marginalized community, what we see on the outside is, as soon as it gets to states' rights, it doesn't work for us. Because especially, and I'll take it here when we talk about, and we don't talk enough about this population, formerly incarcerated and justice impacted individuals. There are various different laws by state that govern when one is seen as quote unquote off paper or able to have their rights to vote. You have some that are, very much indefinite. Florida was one of those that they're still working through. But before we spike the football and say it's done, that they're still working through. We had Arizona, which, yes, while now if you had a first time felony offense, then your right to vote is restored. 2 and 3, you can sit this one out, and that part is harder. And so given, and DC is actually a good space to highlight. DC, because we don't have a prison in DC, the vast majority of our population is exported out across the country, which means where you were incarcerated is not where you're from. So even when you come out trying to figure out what the rules are, this is the power of federal legislation. It makes things sets a standard. It sets a tone. And that in and of itself is a measure of accessibility. And when we don't want to provide that, there's something wrong. The other part, is that this conversation, so we had the For the People Act, which 67% at least of Americans, we can say strongly across party lines, were in favor of this For the People Act in its form as robust as it was. And then we had the Mansion Compromise, in which he was trying to pair some of the For the People Act and pair some of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Again, not the whole of these things, a compromise that is here with some of. And the problem was, first of all, that compromise came out before there was even a vote on the floor. And the reason I bring that up is Sister Quincy is right. A strategy that is only centered around get out the vote is problematic. What do we do when 150 million people turn out the vote? The name of the game is receipts after that. It's us tuning in and saying, for my vote, you bought yourself a new thought partner, and I'm instructing you, Congress, since you move by appetite, on what it is that you would need to do for us. The reason I highlight that is when we look at it in racial equity terms, incrementalism, which Martin Luther King Jr. hit on the head in Letters from a Birmingham Jail, you know, this moderate, let's just incrementally go about it. You know, he may not say this, but I would say it's problematic because there was nothing incremental about racism. There was nothing incremental about slavery. There was an all hands on deck, let's rush for the economic turnout that will be there. So what we sense, and the reason we have this problem, you had 150 million people, the highest turnout that there has been in at least a century. And I would say that a vast majority of them, what we do know is turned out really because they could not stand Donald Trump. Not necessarily an enthusiastic endorsement for anybody else, as much as it was getting out the space. So when we look at these issues, they look at the Justice and Policing Act and police accountability. People are looking at voting rights. People are looking at these infrastructure bills. And when Congress doesn't do anything, or when both parties don't put all, you know, they're all into it, what it translates to the voters is we have a commitment issue. I'm less concerned about the incrementalism if you can tell me from step one that you're already thinking about step 2, 3, 4, and 5 to get to the end goal. But we have a commitment issue, and a lot of it centers around this uncomfortability of race and the realities of what bringing racial equity would bring to bear. And so, you know, that this strategy must be us making sure that, you know, the work that Sister Quincy does, the work that Beau and they do, the work that we do at the Daniel Initiative is making space for everyday people that are on the ground that can't name it, but they know the hurt that they're getting, to be able to engage in these spaces of power from a knowledgeable way and be able to determine for themselves what their lives should look like. And that starts at the ballot box. But that's the pretext to then being able to say, this is what health equity looks like to me. This is what tech equity looks like to me.
Good deal. That you all took the conversation in the absolute direct way that I wanted to lead us, you know, especially since the United States has an insidious need to litigate everything after implementing subpar strategies or subpar legislation. We've seen it pass time and time again on many issue. You know, so like in also speaking to the roots of things, you know, I was in Austin this past weekend, speaking on voting rights at the state capitol, and I want to read a quote that I lifted from Andrea Alexander from her speech at the Capitol this past week, and it speaks to the foundations of what's wrong. You know, what we're experiencing, the after effects that we're experiencing today. And she said, it was the prophet Jeremiah that proclaimed God's anguish and saying, they have treated the wounds of my people carelessly, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. That's from Jeremiah 6:14. Our democracy being under attack is nothing new. In fact, our democracy as a system of government, of the people, by the people, for the people, was under attack in this nation before it was ever established. The United States' lofty democratic ideals of unalienable rights and all persons being born equal was aborted before it was ever born. It was the founding, old white male land-owning enslavers and their co-conspirators who compromised the establishment of true democracy when they intentionally excluded indigenous people and Black and brown people from this, who built this nation on their backs, free of charge, but at many costs. When they excluded those persons from the we in the preamble to our nation's constitution. Yeah, this is nothing new. We're seeing the after effects of what's been designed to protect, candidly, whiteness in this country. And it also has some, global effects as well. And we have, the world looking at us, building their systems, building their institutions off of what America does. So this coordination of institutionalized whiteness is going to be the detriment to everyone else who's in power. So going back to, or everyone else who's not in power. So going back to the DC statehood issue, Beau, if you would, let's talk about, what's specifically at stake, because I believe that this is an all hands on deck moment. Everyone needs to know their place, their part in the struggle, and also what's at stake for them if they don't act. So Beau, if you would come give us a couple of words on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it really is an all hands on deck moment, in that we have taken this piece of legislation and this issue farther forward than ever before. And we are literally on the cusp of success. But the amount of work and the amount of support that's been done inside the district is sort of reaching the top of the curve, or the point, the law of diminishing returns. Sorry, we're hitting the very top of, even if we put in more effort, our returns here in the district aren't gonna have much more impact. We've got to get outside the district, and that's where folks like on this call or watching on the broadcast can be of assistance. Is the fundamental basis of this is that we don't have senators, and our representative can't vote, yet we need senators and representatives to approve this. We are in the ultimate catch-22, and we need help from people across the country. A lot of times I get asked, why does it matter to me? I live in Arizona, or I live in Idaho, or Iowa. Why do I care if DC has statehood? I come out of the LGBT marriage movement, and I long had similar conversations. Well, why do I care about gay marriage if I'm not gay? Because at some level we have understanding of each other, and we have compassion for each other, and we believe in equality for each other. And that's really what the DC statehood fight is about. It's the tagline of our organizations, Equality for DC. And it really is about the fundamental building blocks and whether or not we are a true democracy. If we allow this hole to continue after 210 years, it is much, much harder to make sure that we fill the other holes, or that we prevent the other holes from forming as different attacks on democracy continue. We have to have a fundamental baseline that everyone is represented, that everyone has an equal vote, that everyone has an equal voice. And if we don't have that fundamental baseline, all of the other attacks will continue. Even if we pass the For the People Act and we pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, there will be a new wave of things that come up. They'll come up anyway, but we will be more successful at defending those and maintaining and establishing. Maintaining is the wrong word. It's never existed for many people. Establishing a true democracy once we fill all the holes. And this is one of the holes that is the oldest and longest standing. So the specific urge is to call your whoever. Not only your senators and your representatives, but your neighbors and your parishioners and your Girl Scout troop leaders and your whatever, and start working the networks that everybody has. The joys of social media are that we can be social, but the old school stuff works too. And just have a conversation about the fact that 700,000 people, mostly Black and brown, pay taxes and have no representation, and 535 people elected from everywhere else get to tell us what we get to do with our own laws and our own money. It is fundamentally a violation of the basis of democracy.
Good deal. Sister Quincy, you want to follow us up?
Sure. So I call other people senators because I don't have my own senators, and that is my way of lobbying my senators. Just for those of you in DC, it makes a point to some degree. I think for me, I think what I would really like people to do is to recognize the moment that we're in when it comes to the For the People Act. We have, starting in August, we're going to have the data from the census released for redistricting purposes. And that process is going to begin shortly thereafter this fall, which is going to lay the stage for the next 10 years. that can either look like it has, which is extreme partisan gerrymandering in many states where people's votes are essentially rendered powerless, or that could look different because there are reforms in the For the People Act that would ban partisan gerrymandering and remake that process. We also have the 2022 election coming up, which could go one of two ways, depending on if we are able to pass some kind of basic standards for access to the ballot, like we see in For the People Act. So this omnibus bill is like the ACA of democracy reform. It is large. It is transformative, getting to what Breon was talking about earlier. It would fundamentally change the way that our democracy works for the better, and it would come at it from several different angles, from money in politics to ethics to voting rights to redistricting. And it needs to pass soon for it to have the impacts that it needs to have on the upcoming very, very pivotal events, the redistricting and 2022 election. We need our Senate that has the power to pass this bill. We need the Democratic caucus to unify around a strategy, and we need the president to be clear that that is the strategy and to rally his folks around that strategy in the Senate to get this bill passed. And we need it to be unified and comprehensive. We don't need it picked apart around the edges. And senators need to hear the urgency from their people about this issue. There's a lot going on that they're distracted by, and we can't let this fall by the wayside because the moment is now.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And Breon, as a man of faith that is now working in politics, let's hear from you as pertaining to specifically what people of faith, or what we should be calling on our faith leaders to do.
Yeah, so, and before I do that, I must apologize because I used a term and then everyone else used it. And I said all hands on deck, and that's ableist. And I didn't mean to use that. It's better to say that, make sure that everyone is at the table. And you know, and that's just in line with, we very much believe in collective liberation. And so I try to be not perfect, but every now and then, you know, I slip, but I caught that, and I wanted to make sure that I named that. But I think that the faith community really needs to understand its power. And I'm working on a book really on the intersection of faith and policy and power. But one of the things that I find interesting is you had the faith community that was pivotal to delivering the receipts for the civil rights movement. What were the receipts? It was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These pieces said, this is what all of these sit-ins, these boycotts, the sacrifices that were being made was about. You know, they weren't just sitting in churches singing Kumbaya. As they were working, you had Martin Luther King Jr., you had, you know, a number of these countless leaders also translating that into power and negotiations with Congress to produce legislation. The Daniel Initiative is a for-profit entity. We do a lot of nonprofit social justice work, we do, but we are mistaken for a nonprofit. The reason we're a for-profit entity is because I just strongly don't believe that you can 501c3 yourself to liberation and justice. And in part, I feel that, you know, you have in some ways, hands tied behind their back with the Johnson Amendment, which came right after the civil rights era, and looking at the power of not just people, but the people of faith in utilizing their voice. And so what was put before it was, you know, and it makes sense to some extent, but it makes sense if you want to use your voice, there's some limitations, you know, if you want these dollars. But we find that even still today, Black, brown, multi-marginalized communities are moving forward despite the lack of resources, the lack of support, the lack of money, the lack of funds. And yet, like Stacey Abrams was a good case. She was not funded when she first ran. In fact, the money was put behind her candidate. And only after she showed up with people power did the dollars and these other things flow her way. So it showed that you can do things without having to be beholden on the money side. But it means we have to own and know our power, right? We know that regardless of whether people show up every Sunday, Friday, whichever way people believe and worship, when times get tough, they're going to their faith leaders. When our family members die, we're going to our faith leaders. We're checking in, and that goes to show that there is a level of trust and or influence. And, you know, I would never say that churches should ever endorse a political party or a person, because that gets you into trouble and people change. But there has always been the ability to educate people on the policy, on how these policies affect their lives, help cast a vision of what this end goal is, despite the political optics, despite the parties, despite the personalities. And so we sit in a time where we're in a global pandemic, where people are looking for direction. We're in a time where a lot of things that we said could never happen, like, you know, I'll never let my workers telework, because efficiency is us being in the office. And guess what? We found out you can be efficient at home. You can telework. A lot of the assumptions that we had being challenged. So I say that to say we have a lot of people who feel they're up in these different crises. They're leaning on these faith leaders. They're leaning on even those that, you know, we have and we believe, as rightfully so, in the right to not believe. They're coming into these community leaders. They are checking in on each other. We ought to use that base of power to help educate and make people aware. Just simply because at the end of the day, people are well educated on their pain. But where they need more instruction is on how to navigate these spaces of power. And that's where the faith community, that's where these community leaders, that's where, you know, Sister Quincy and Beau and I and organizations like that can be helpful in helping to empower people.
Thank you very much for that call to action and for that charge on the faith community. You know, one of my most highest esteemed advocates or advocate models that I, you know, reference was Jesus. He was a man about the polis, organizing the people, helping them to understand various issues. He did not mince words, and sometimes he also questioned and charged whomever. Whether it be his own people or the people in power. He was, yeah, that righteously indignation that he presented in various places throughout the biblical narrative is one of the things that keeps my fire going. And so as you all being my co-conspirators of righteous indignation in the political sphere, I am grateful for your presence and for your gifts and your talents and for your witness that you have given us today. In the last few seconds, because I know we got meetings to go to, in the last few seconds, what is in the last few seconds, in at least a few words as possible, what is each of your specific calls to action for the people who are viewing right now? Beau, if you would come first.
Yeah, go to dcvote.org and take action, no matter where you are in the country.
All right, that's a good one. That's a good one to go to, because it's everyone has to be at the table for this movement, right? Breon, please come.
I would say reach out to your senators and your congressmen to require that Strong for the People Act in its robust form, form that it be passed. And when the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is put out there, again, the name of the game is no one gets a pass. We show up at every issue, at every table, and weigh in.
Amen. And Sister Quincy, finish us off. Last but not least.
Amen. Amen to what Breon says. And you can also go to faithfuldemocracy.us on our Take Action page, and we have tips for having Hill visits that are virtual, as well as call-ins and emails. Just make sure that your voice is heard. It's a critical moment.
Well, beloved, you have heard it from three of my favorite colleagues and some very prominent persons in the struggle. There's a lot of people doing a lot of work in regards to voting rights, in regards to DC statehood, in regards to all the issues that are intersecting across racial lines, but centered has its crosshairs on the Black and brown population in America. So please find some way to get active and informed and be about the work of liberation and transformation in this country, because we've come too far. We've gone through too much. We're too many are suffering for any of us to come off the plow or to come out of the game. So thank you for joining us in this conversation. Breon, Quincy, Beau, thank you very much for your witness again. And please, for our viewers, please go to nationalcouncilofchurches.us to find out more information about how we are advocating for justice in the public sphere, in the state and in the federal and local areas. And then also find out, sign up for our updates so you can stay informed. And peace be with you all. Bye.